My interests are like so many others in this field, understanding and improvement, and how to combine those things. So for me, a background in college, studying biology, really heightened my interest in mechanisms, how it is cells, for example, organize themselves to have function. And that was a continuing interest in trying to understand the mechanisms, the how of things. I think it's rooted in my appreciation of biology and that science and what it could contribute. But secondly, though, there was also an overriding interest in social justice. As a college kid, I had the privilege of being a big brother with a number of kids in an orphanage. And one of the things that became clear to me was the commonality of their experience. The problems weren't so much in the kids as they were in the environments that the kids experienced. And not just their parents, but the broader environments as well, the limited opportunities and exposures that they had relative to so many others. So that heightened my sense of social justice and the need to sort of combine those two interests of understanding and particular kinds of improvement related to inequities especially. So that led me to, when I left college, instead of following the path I thought I was on, pre-med, heading off to VISTA, which is essentially a form of domestic Peace Corps, volunteers in service to America. And there I lived and worked in public housing and had the privilege of learning alongside and being protected by low-income families and understanding their experiences and the conditions that they experienced, but also their stories and the strengths that they brought to living their lives and how they supported each other. And that led me to sort of look for then how to bring those things together. Were there mechanisms that might help basically people work together to create the conditions that could lead to change and improvement in the environments that they experienced and the behaviors and especially the outcomes for them and their children, families, neighbors, and others. And so that set me up to be looking for those things. As it happened, I again, no background in psychology from college, I not only found in a bookstore looking for a book on community organizing, I was reading about the practices related to community organizing and how it is people in groups organize themselves to bring about change and improvement. What I found was mostly stories. And what was lacking was mechanisms, principles, the how. So amazingly, in the same bookstore, I picked up a copy of B.F. Skinner's Science and Human Behavior at the same time. And I was reading these concurrently. And lo and behold, there were these principles like negative reinforcement, a term that I had not seen before, that helped me understand how it is that organizing worked and what principles might underlie it and how those could be marshaled to be more systematic about change and improvement. So that may set me looking for environments that would allow me to pursue that a little bit more so as to figure out kind of what was next. So picture the environment in the Department of Human Development and Family Life, then called now Applied Behavioral Science, in the early 70s, early to mid 70s. A time when I studied there, but then came on in the department in 1975 as a young faculty member and researcher. Very exciting place. People everywhere are looking to figure out how it is that environments affected behavior and outcomes. One could look at one corner and see Mott Wolf and his colleagues at Achievement Place basically constructing an innovation that was designed to allow young people who'd been in trouble with the law to do better and to create basically a life for themselves. Their teaching family model was an extraordinary example of this. One could look at another corner and see Don Bichelle working on follow-through, this educational innovation designed to help young people continue to learn, children continue to learn after Head Start, and so on. In every direction, there were these folks who were trying to figure things out, trying to understand, but especially trying to create innovations that would solve problems. And what an extraordinary place. Later in my life, as I thought about and read more about leadership and great groups, the department was a great group, composed of many great groups. It was a great group in the sense that everyone felt like they were on a mission. People had this calling, this possibility that behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis, important qualifier, right? Meaning you had to work on socially important problems. That this field could solve socially important problems. And people were working on that in lots of places, lots of teams, and it was a great group in another sense. It was an island with bridges to the mainland. And I think about that as being so important. It considered itself special, apart, so it could do things that made sense for the purposes that people had set for themselves, but always bridges to the mainland. Faculty came from sociology, from education, and other fields, and they were connecting to other entities to channel in ideas, innovations that could be tested with this paradigm. So it was extraordinary in that sense. The teams had autonomy, so we could evolve to address the problems that each of us had. In my context of community research and action, behavioral community psychology, if you would, as the field that subfield had yet to be known, we were trying to figure out how to apply these principles to enable the development work, the community development work, to change conditions that could improve outcomes for people in communities. And so we were trying to sort that out in our own ways. There was autonomy, but there was also exchange. There was a sense, since there were so many people working on applied issues, that we could look around and see innovations that were springing up in different contexts. And that allowed us to exchange and share, because all of us were trying to figure out how to understand and improve things. Extraordinary place of generosity. We weren't theory builders, and as such, there was no need to hold on to the words, right? The words weren't important. Nowhere near as important as the practices that emerged, the methods that emerged, and the results that were being accrued. There was also the gift of time. As faculty and as teams, most of us were grant supported. We figured out a way to attract some resources for the purposes we had. As a result, we had time. We had time to try things, to make mistakes, to fail, which all of us did, and then to figure out how to get up again, try something new, adapt, and in time develop some methods that seemed to have some relative advantage. Methods for assessment, for planning, for intervention especially, and to test those out and eventually to convert those methods into capabilities that others could use themselves. So when we think about these core purposes, right, of understanding and improvement that were shared by this community of practitioners who were calling themselves applied behavior analysts, and other things because of the connection to other disciplines. When we think about what had relative advantage in the field for us as we were engaging with others, there are several things. One of them is measurement. The behavioral dimension in applied behavior analysis really centered on measurement. You needed to be able to track things, to see what behavior looked like over time, to see where discontinuities occurred. But it also applied to the changes in the environments that were affecting behavior. We didn't have a term in those days for implementation science, but the foreshadowing of that was in the measurement of the implementation of interventions was equally important, right? We had to understand how those were that was changing and unfolding, evolving, and emerging over time, and its association with improvements we were seeing in behavior and outcome. The second advantage we had, relative advantage to many other subdisciplines, was intervention. The behavioral principles offered us some guidance for what could work. There are some components of behavioral intervention, providing information, enhancing skills, that are similarly practiced in many other disciplines, education, for example. And those are relatively weak forms of behavior change, but they don't invite opposition. So many of us, I certainly did early in my career, and continue to in some ways, lean on those methods of intervention because we could do them. People didn't resist them. And they left open the space for more powerful interventions and involved changing prevailing contingencies of reinforcement, opportunities to respond, things that we think of now as assuring more equal opportunities for engagement, for learning, for the things that really produce inequities, were not as frequently applied early on in the game. And the last relative advantage was the technological criterion of applied behavior analysis, the dimensions of technology, really called on us to describe things well enough that others could replicate them. The notion was going toward what we would later think of in terms of open source, right? We were trying to describe things well enough that anyone else could pick them up, adapt them for their context, and apply them for a gain. It was meant to be a sharing field. And at the time, there was some debate, this was 70s, 80s, where there was a current, Todd Risley was a big part of this, so were others, where the notion was you should certify procedures, not people. And the idea there, the concept was that it's not to basically lift up people, credentialed people. It's a game of lifting up things that work and enabling and use with a technological criterion, make it so that others could use those things, whether or not they were credentialed, whether they had any degree whatsoever in any field. And that's an abiding value of the field. So those three aspects of measurement, of intervention, and the technological orientation, I think, gave us relative advantage when we were engaging other disciplines. So I think each of us encountered limitations depending on our context, depending on the issues that we were addressing and how it is we were trying to go about addressing them, the challenges that we saw. In the behavioral community psychology domain, there were, or behavioral research and action, depending on, it got different names, different points in time and in different contexts. There were a few challenges that became clear. And Rich Rakos and another colleague and I published a recent piece where we looked at the field of behavioral community intervention and classified it by the kinds of behavior change strategies, among other classifications. And one of the things that pops out as you clearly see it is that there were relatively weak forms of behavior change strategy that were more frequently employed. Providing information, enhancing skills especially. Designing programs that might serve modest numbers of people was another strategy that was put in play with relatively great frequency, as opposed to changing broader systems, changing prevailing contingencies, modifying policies in broader systems. Those were much less prevalent. Not surprisingly, when you engage in that work, there's opposition to be experienced. And as we experienced in our own work, when you're engaged in trying to change policy, it's common to experience direct opposition. And we can tell some stories about that later if it's useful. A second related limitation, I think, is the predominance of the lower socioecological level. A term that you see much more in public health and some other related fields, primarily individuals and families, relationships, and less communities and broader systems. The prior director, Frieden, of Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, laid out a sort of hierarchy of ecological levels and what makes a difference and the contribution of change at different levels. And he's very critical of the preponderance of work in that context of health education, for example, which is primarily focused on individual behavior change, the stuff of our field, using relatively weak forms of behavior change, including providing information. So what this, I think, sets up is the need to reach out to other disciplines that are engaged at other levels and using other strategies. I was privileged to be part of, as a joint appointment from the very beginning, an Institute for Public Affairs and Community Development. My colleagues there were political scientists, policy analysts, folks in community development. We were the AND Community Development, our research group. So it led us to be looking outward for others who were using methods and approaches to at least understand, if not to try to change, broader policy and the like. One excursion I will digress with at the moment is an example of this, is an example of the reasons why I think behavioral analysts have shied away from this. Let me just say, for example, parenthetically, the analytic criterion in behavior analysis puts a premium on control, the conditions that one can control, for purposes of discovery, valid conditions. But one limitation of that is that it sets aside the things that we can't control as areas where we perhaps shouldn't investigate. That's a problem. That's a limitation. That's a blinder. And that binds the field, if you would, insofar as people adhere to that. It binds the field to fairly limited impact. And so we might think of the work in behavioral community psychology as behavior research in action, as trying to balance, harmonize, optimize the dimensions of behavioral and of analytic in particular, and applied. If you're working on socially important problems, you need to find other ways of contributing to understanding other than controlling every aspect of the situation. Why is it less probable that we do so? Well, consequences. An anecdote. I had the opportunity to, early on, to study a neighbor state senator was introducing a bill on child passenger safety. This is back in the day, when many kids were allowed to float around in the rear of station wagons, and this was common practice. And Kansas was the second state to introduce a bill requiring some form of this. We provided conducted behavioral observations in several communities in Kansas, including right by the State House, at the percentage of children who are restrained properly or not, and presented that information along with other detailed information from other partners organized by the medical society that was trying to influence public policy. In that testimony, the behavioral observation piece that we conducted was set alongside personal testimony by nurses, particularly nurses who'd been at the bedside of children who had been slammed up against the side of vehicles or thrown from them. That testimony turned out to be particularly powerful, as you can imagine. But within 24 hours of returning to the university, the vice chancellor called me into his office, a rare experience in my young faculty members' experience, and said, I heard you were at the State House, and we've had some calls. I understand you presented on this bill and offered some data about what it is you'd learned in your observations. And we've had complaints. And he paused. And at this point, I think I'd been recently tenured. One of the privileges of tenure, responsibilities of tenure, is to pursue things that are important and not approved necessarily. And I explained why and how, what we were doing. And this was part of my science and practice and responsibility as a researcher interested in public interest. And his response was, will you be doing this again? And I said, my interest had been piqued by your curiosity and the state senators, and I think it's more likely now, actually, after this conversation. But the privilege of tenure, right, allowed for that kind of pursuit, that kind of response. And I think it's just an example, and there were others, that I think led me to appreciate that it's understandable why political science is not an applied science. Because of the power, the differential power of those doing the studying and those who control policy. And it was no less true of me wandering in with behavioral observation of a phenomenon that I thought was important, that our team thought was important. But it did lead us to do some more studies. So we led an implementation study and examined the relative rates using sampling procedure in, I think it was half a dozen states, assembled a group of colleagues in other states who were similarly interested in public policy and behavior analysis and behavioral science and measurement. And we conducted observations, time series observations in communities in half a dozen states and looked at this as a kind of interrupted time series design, if you would. And Tom Seekins was the lead on this. Another colleague, a former student, and leader in this field. So I offer that as an explanation, but not an excuse, right? That such work leads to opposition and resistance, and that's part of what we need to be able to understand and address. I was a goaltender in hockey, high school hockey team. And one of the experiences of a goaltender, particularly a mediocre one, is that the puck goes in the net with some regularity and the light goes off and you fail. And it's very visible, highly visible. But you get up again. My favorite image from that time is a photo of me getting up off the ice after a goal. I think that's what groups do, right? That's what individuals and groups do. We fail, and we've got to figure out how to get up again. But what's going to allow us to get up is a better game. A better game than we've got. A better game than our discipline alone offers us. So hence the exploration, right? Who else is doing this work? What do they have to say? Are there people who could show me around, protect me as I was exploring, help me figure out what the big pieces are, and how to bring those together in a more tangled web of influence? So thinking of this as not the tree of life in a hierarchical sense, that my work descends from Skinner. That's, I think, my group, my work, our team's work descends in a direct line from the patriarchs of the field. I think that's nonsense. I don't think that describes how evolution happens. I think the evolution occurs much more like a tangled web. Much more like a tangled web. So the question is, I think, how do we secure the influences that will broaden our work so that we can take advantage of what other smarter people in other contexts are learning? So that leads to exploration. In communities, the Time in Vista was one of those early explorations in communities where I was so aware of the strengths people had and figuring out how to lead their lives in tough contexts, grossly under-resourced in their families, still figuring out how to get things done, how to make things happen for themselves and their families. But similarly, what fields had things to offer. So there were several fields and exposures that then happened successively for me, but also for our group, our team, our center. The first of those is community psychology. It was clear from contact with boundary spanners from that field that they were seeing things in behavior analysis and we were seeing things in their field that suggested why some union ought to occur, some connections ought to be made. So exploring community psychology, particularly for the attractiveness that it had related to its emphasis on collaboration and social change. It made the case that work needs to be done with others. It's a power with paradigm, right? Not a power over paradigm. This is a bit of a contrast to those that would maximize the analytic criterion to demonstrate control over the behavior of others. This is a counterpoint to that, right? It's saying that if you expect people to take up the innovation, continue it themselves, use it in their context, then you better have power with. You better collaborate. You better share risks, resources, responsibilities, roles, rewards with others. And so that's a big idea, not unique to community psychology, but prevalent in that field, core value. So we're social justice, social change. So those were important. The question became how to then explore it. Todd Risley, who was one of the founders of the field, and a faculty member and a mentor and someone who'd pop in from wherever he was over his whole life. He'd pop back in to our group and ask questions, probe and prod. And one of the early ways he was prodding was say, you know what you ought to do? You've got this interest in community and behavioral, you ought to form an interest group. And he was then president of AABT, Association for Advanced Behavior Therapy. I'll appoint you and whoever else you want to bring in as a partner and co-leaders of an interest group. So we connected with a bunch of colleagues who were doing this work and formed an interest group. And that one might have been called Behavior Analysis and Community Action. I'm not sure. I don't recall. Behavioral community psychology. It went by different names depending on the context. That didn't matter. It was connecting those things. That led to then forming, meeting up in different contexts, in community psychology contexts, in behavioral contexts. It's that bridge, right? It's the field version of that bridge being an island, right? The bridge that connects islands. In this case, the field of community psychology. So this was a really important point of connection and one that led to a number of allies and partners in this work who are also there to lead us, show us around. Not just me, but all of my colleagues. Show us around. What's here? What's in this corner? What's in that corner? And the usual question that I would ask is, who are you learning from? So when one person would reach out, we'd get to be friends and colleagues and ask, well, who are you learning from? And then would approach them with the name of their buddies who were happy to introduce and connect. And this led to the strength of, led to the bridge that allowed for the kind of sharing. There's a notion in contemporary evolutionary theory that you may be aware of, I wasn't until recently, lateral gene transfer. It's not that tree of life is passed down hierarchically, like the history of behavior analysis from its founders, but rather there are these imports of whole organisms from other domains even. The absorption of bacteria by cells that then allow for power cells that occur in the form of mitochondria in cells. The notion here is that there are these big jumps that occur when there are imports from other spots. And so each of us, I think, in the field who've been doing applied behavior analysis, we're looking for that to be that bridge, to be a conduit for imports. And so those ideas, big ideas, came in from that field. There's a second gift and a second exploration that came by way of really an extraordinary opportunity. It had some forays into public health, particularly valued its commitment to social action, its commitment to broader systems change, but especially for population health and health equity. The health of populations and redressing the inequities that occur across groups by virtue of their differential exposures and their vulnerabilities and access. And so that field offered promise. So how to get in? Well, in 1990, we were in a scouting mission by the local state health foundation, the Kansas Health Foundation. We surfaced for them as a group to be invested in. And they established an endowment for our group and also a professorship for me. What it did was assure that we'd be around for a while and we'd have some time to explore things and a little discretion as to how it is we did with some resources from the endowment. But most importantly, they offered a bridge to colleagues who were the leaders in the field, foundation could bring in whomever they wanted to advise them in their field, in this case of community health initiatives. This was what they were ushering in the 90s, the early 90s. And we were brought in to help build capacity for that and to monitor and evaluate the community health initiatives. We had to figure that out. We did not have capabilities for doing this yet. We had to build them as we were going down the road, if you would. But what that did was lead to these points of connection that were extraordinary, amazing, including relationships that allowed for other things. So one of the relationships allowed for an invitation to me for one of the two best sabbaticals I ever had, which was with the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine, NASM as it's now called, National Academy of Sciences of Medicine, that had a need for someone to help plan a new study on the future of public health in the 21st century. And they said, you can come in as a scholar in residence and help us plan. So I did. And what that gave license to do was speak with many much smarter people about this field that I barely understood. And to then discover what they regarded as the critical elements on what the building blocks, if you would, for what that future of public health should be in the next century. Extraordinary, extraordinary opportunity. And that led to relationships, connections, and learning with many smarter people that continued through some subsequent appointments in the National Academy. And the last leap was in global health. Think about these as sort of decades of engagements, decades of learning and exploration. The 80s, beginning to explore community psychology and continuing, and then subsequent layers of influence in this tangled web. The 90s, of public health, continuing to this day with particular emphasis. And lastly, around 2000, actually just before that, the opportunity to begin to work in global health. Toward the end of a sabbatical at the National Academy, I was introduced to some people in the Pan American Health Organization, who was the regional office for the Americas of the World Health Organization. And they were intrigued by the community toolbox, which had been going for a while by then, a few years. Loved the idea, saw it as a capacity building resource. Wanted to figure out how to connect. So we began talking. Several years later, they arranged for us to become designated as a World Health Organization Collaborating Center. This was 2004, almost 20 years ago. And that led to, again now, connecting with people who are smarter, doing bigger, better things, but particularly working in under-resourced environments. How do they figure out how to scale in a context where there are so few of them? So imagine this now, the regional office for the Americas, the regional office of WHO for Africa, has 2 full-time equivalents devoted for health promotion and working on social determinants of health. Big, big issues. This is for the whole region. So they were under-resourced, grossly under-resourced, looking for partners to help them build capacity, expand the evidence base, and that allowed us to sort of define us and define our purposes and refine it basically in collaboration with these folks who knew and understood much more than we did about how to do this work and especially how to scale it. That led to the second sabbatical, 3 years later, after our center was designated as a WHO Collaborating Center, we started establishing some relationships. And I had an invitation to do a sabbatical at the World Health Organization in Geneva, to work with the health promotion team and to be a bridge to the group that was working on the Commission on Social Determinants of Health. Now a prominent term, this was back in 2007. Extraordinary time there, exciting time there. And what became clear to me was the challenges of capacity building. How is it you build capacity for a workforce that consists of people who include tribal leaders, mayors, others, who are trying to bring about changes in systems and contexts and policy and in communities and countries? How do we build that capacity when so few people have access to advanced degrees, and to training that might enable them to do this work of collaborative action. So this is, in effect, set us up for refining our purposes. So think of this as a tangled web of influences, right? It's informed by the guidance of the current dimensions, some current dimensions in applied behavior analysis, but also informed by those doing the work in other disciplines that brought their own relative advantage to doing the work and brought their own challenges. So when we were asked to formulate, as a center, formulate what our goals were as a WHO collaborating center, they nudged us to name our goals in things that they regarded the world needed. And I love this because it helped crystallize our center's communications about what we were about. So this is specific to the collaborating center, but it also informed what our Center for Community Health and Development were about. First, they said we need to expand the evidence base for how collaborative action affects change and improvement. And we need to, with respect to population level outcomes and reduction of inequities. But this notion of we need to expand the evidence base of collaborative action. This comes back to the mechanisms, the hows. How is it this works? What are the things that people are doing that enable and that impede their efforts to change the environment, the context in which people live their lives? Secondly, we've got to build capacity for this work. We have to figure out how to scale up what it is we offer so that people can be able to do this work. So it became clear in the early days when I was in Vista, back in the days doing community organizing, it's the conditions that we were experiencing in that low-income public housing project were not unique. Those conditions of oppression, the conditions of limited opportunity, the conditions that made it challenging for people to get access to the same opportunities that so many of us have had to live a full life, were not equally present for many of our friends and neighbors in that place. But it wasn't unique to that place. If that's the case, then here's where the guidance from the technological criterion comes in place. We better be clear about how to do this work, clear enough that people will never meet in places we'll never be, can do this work a little more effectively because of the privilege we've had to be at this work over time. So I hope it's clear that there's this braiding of exposures, experiences that informed the development of capabilities. And this is the notion, if you're going to have to scale something, you have to go beyond. My team and I are able to use this method to bring about change and improvement in the conditions that we control. That's sufficient to be able to publish, communicate our findings and our discoveries about cause and effect in particular contexts. It's insufficient if we hope to scale what we do and to be able to have some impact beyond. We need to work with mediators and others who can apply what works, adapt it for context, and apply it in their circumstances to achieve similar or better outcomes than we were able to accomplish in their places with their resources, which typically differ dramatically for the same resources that we had available to us under our experimental conditions. This is that distinction between, and we talk about in science and discovery, between internal validity and external validity, right? With internal validity, we're trying to maximize our capacity to control conditions well enough that we can demonstrate cause and effect, turn on and off an intervention, have the intervention occur for some but not others, and assure that those conditions are present so we can discover with more certainty the relationship between cause and effect. Good work to be done, important. It's on the experimental end of the continuum. Glad it's happening, very important, can help us discover what works. It's low, though, in external validity because the context for discovery are not the same context for application. The people doing the implementation are differently trained. They may not be trained. and they're differently resourced to be able to, and they certainly have different degrees of control. They need to work with others to assure the conditions that could achieve improvement in a sustainable way when we leave, when we're gone, which is inevitably the case, right? So that led us to try to convert some of the things we were learning into capabilities. Two of them, I think, are outputs of those discoveries and time, the benefits of time, in our center. And those partners that we've attracted to this work. One is the Community Toolbox. Community Toolbox was really a concept. It was an idea. What if we had this box of tools that was available to us and others that could be drawn upon to prompt how it is we might act in a particular circumstance to achieve an end that we desired? What would that box of tools look like? What would the capabilities that would be referenced? What skills would be associated with those capabilities? And how would we go about constructing that? Well, that same foundation that I mentioned, the Kansas Health Foundation, gave us a seed grant to basically develop the concept. This was in 1994, so almost 30 years ago. And we assembled a team, I think another great group. Vincent Francisco, whom you've already talked with, is part of that, was one of the core members of that team, a cultural anthropologist in our group, our center, Jerry Schultz, another partner in that team, remarkable, each in their own ways, and then a couple of community psychologists, Tom Wolfe, Bill Berkowitz. We met for 20 years by phone, working on this project. Funded, not funded, talking about how to get this moving forward, and then meeting with a community of partners who basically adopted this as being something that ought to occur, including our partners at, as broadly as the World Health Organization regional office and office in Geneva. Think about the Community Toolbox as where behavioral community psychology meets the web. 1994. Vincent Francisco, who understood the web well before most of us did, had seen it coming, prepared for it, saw it as a way to create a free and open source set of tools for the world. And the structure for each of the learning modules there was what we learned in the 70s when we were doing behavioral community instruction. So think of the structure, each of the 700 or so learning units, learning modules, sections, if you will, has the elements of behavioral instruction, rationales, clear descriptions of the tasks, the behaviors related to engagement in leading a meeting, advocating for a change, et cetera, and exemplars. The idea was if we could provide examples of the application of that skill in different contexts, addressing different problems, we could promote generalization. So the elements of behavioral instruction, known really to us and practiced, we did a lot of this work in the 70s, others before this, was basically the core of the Community Toolbox. But it met this new emerging technology that Vincent Francisco understood, member of the team, and with the encyclopedic knowledge of our colleagues in community psychology, starting with Tom Wolfe, Bill Berkowitz, and the appreciation of cultural anthropology and action anthropology that our colleague Jerry Schultz, who was integral to this team, and then in later years, Christina Holt, who's guided it ever since. All members of the Center for Community Health and Development and/or close colleagues. This allowed us time. We had 30 years. We've been at this for almost 30 years to build something that can grow and expand to the reach that it's had. Now, last year, reaching over approximately 6 million unique users in approximately 300 countries. Once we started removing language barriers by putting it all in Spanish, partially in Arabic, and some other languages to come, we could take down the barriers, if you would, for people using it from around the world. So now I think that 30 or 40% of the top 10 countries in the world are from Latin America. When you take down the barrier of language. Our aspiration is that this will appear in every UN language in its entirety. We're not there yet. We need to work to get it there. A colleague at the WHO, the World Health Organization, during my sabbatical time, Gowden Galea, who headed up the Health Promotion Office, said to me, this was in 2004, during my sabbatical at the World Health Organization in Geneva, Gowden Galea, who had invited me in, said, you know, this toolbox is amazing. This is a great resource for the world. You've got to make it free and open source. And in those days, that was uncommon, right? People held on to things with copyright. And what the technology allowed and what, frankly, our partners were demanding is that we make this free and open source. Well, that opened things up. That made the world an ally, right? And partners an ally in seeing it taken up, adopted, used, and put in place. There's a second capability that emerged from this also braiding of influences. And that's a technology for participatory monitoring and evaluation. Our colleagues at the World Health Organization and also in the US were looking for methodologies for monitoring and evaluation of comprehensive community initiatives that could be used to basically help understand and analyze the contribution of these complex systems that were being introduced, right? And what they were looking to do is help them and help us understand what was happening and to what effect. And so there was a demand for this, and as we refined that over the years from the early work in the 90s, and then undergirded some technology for doing this, we were able to build some systematic approaches for being able to, including with online systems, for being able to document the unfolding of comprehensive interventions over time, but also to characterize those interventions in a way that will lead to understanding and adaptation, improvement. And this is scalable, it turns out. In the past few years, I continue to direct the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Community Health and Development in retirement, and it's a joy. But one of the things that I've gotten to do in the past few years in response to a call out from WHO is they were looking for some help in monitoring and evaluating the COVID response in countries in the African region. So we designed a system using the community checkbox, which is this technology for this. And now we're just finishing up the first 3 case studies and a summary report of the application of this system in Gabon, Kenya, and Senegal, and what they're learning about what factors enabled and impeded the response, and what bent the curve. This is a term that people use in public health for what bent the curve on the rates of the new cases, the incidence of COVID-19 as it was emerging in these countries, where the key thing is it's participatory. The construction of knowledge is a social construction. It's not constructed by outsider evaluators, scientists like our group. Rather, it's constructed by those doing the work. Why? Because if they construct the meaning, they're closer to it, they understand it, and they're more likely to be able to apply it in a sustained way. So from its very beginnings, applied behavior analysis was conceptualized as an evolving practice. As Mott Wolf and Todd Risley explained to me, what they did when they were defining the dimensions of the field were to look around and see where the best practices would occur and to begin to identify the attributes of what they regarded as being the best practices. They were in this emergent field. So the first 2 words in the title, some current dimensions of applied behavior analysis, the foundational piece, were perhaps, Todd Risley basically said to me, you got to pay attention. Those first 2 words are the most important. Todd, not necessarily a humble person, but one with deep humility, I think, deepest humility, said my contribution to that paper was the word some. we had to make clear that we haven't got it all. We haven't described this field fully. And that current was the clearly operative term. The notion was this was field not only would evolve, it ought to, it needed to address the problems in ways that mattered in the context that people were living their lives. So in my experience, there were three drivers of evolution of our center's work, but I think of other centers' work as well. And the first of those is engagement. Engagement in different communities, fields, networks. All of us did this. Each of the centers that have stayed active in applied behavior analysis have done this. They've engaged the communities that mattered to them. They've engaged in the networks, the fields that were critical to them inhaling the innovations that were going to enable their work to advance, to get back on track, to get beyond their initial failures as they were trying to do the work. A second driver in this was building methods and capabilities. That driver is an important one. It said that you not only go beyond what we can do, what I can do individually or our center can do, but to methods that could be described well enough that others could replicate them. And then to go beyond that to begin to create a technology where others can put this in play and can replicate it themselves. The open source community toolbox is one of those innovations that meets that technological criterion, I think, and is that a capability that others can use as well. So is the participatory monitoring and evaluation protocols for engaging those most affected stakeholders in giving meaning to the data and what they're seeing, what the implications are for adjustment. And lastly, partnering. What I observed from the very beginning of my mentors in the field, and I'm thinking about Mont Wolf in particular, was his humility. Mont said what we did was follow around those who were artists. And we tried to describe what it is they were doing. So as Mont was building the achievement place model, that system for advancing and assuring better outcomes for youth, what he was saying with great humility and accuracy is we were following around Lonnie and Elaine Phillips, the first teaching parents who were artists, who were gifted in attracting and establishing themselves as important models and reinforcers for the kids. What were they doing? Could we describe that well enough that that could be repeated by others who may not have their gifts? Secondly, so we got to be able to do that with humility and in a way that adds value. It's clear that we need to be able to understand what in our field, applied behavior analysis, does bring value. So we don't go in with just hanging our heads, but rather reminding ourselves that it's measurement, it's principles of integrated intervention, it's our technological bent that often adds value wherever we are. And that's what has allowed us to partner locally and to partner globally. I think for most of us, for many of us, if not all of us, this work has been a joy. It's been something we choose to do because we love it, because it adds value to the world. It helps this work of addressing socially important problems with others who have talent and trying to do that systematically so that others can learn from it and do it themselves. What good work, what a blessing. When I retired in 2015 for the first time, before going part-time, my kids gave me a gift. It's a picture of me in my first office. I was wearing work boots. It was a loving gift from them. And below that gift was a quote from Mark Twain. Let me read it. "What work I have done because it's play." And I think that's been what's kept us going. This is play. That's why we keep doing it. That's why those of us find a way to keep engaged in the work and connected to those who have been such an important part of our meaning making in our lives and our opportunities, extraordinary opportunities. So this work has been a privilege. Thank you.